cause for just changing your prices online for every individual is really difficult to do?
Yeah, so there might just be administrative costs, right? It might just be hard to be giving all the quotes of different prices to different consumers. And even if you could, consumers might get really confused because they don't know what price to expect. They don't know whether to visit your website, et cetera, et cetera. Some people might also just think it's unfair that different people pay different prices, right? And this can alienate consumers and hurt you in the long term. Another huge problem is that, imagine that, I try to charge a lower price to Maria than I want to charge to Monica, right? Then Maria might buy the thing and sell it to Monica, right? So that would undermine any attempt to do this. And this is a real problem in practice. So when, sorry, the discussion of this later. Oh yeah, okay. I'll just leave that to later. Okay, so then a final reason is it's just really hard to figure out what different people are willing to pay. Like, how do I know exactly how much you are willing to pay or someone else is willing to pay for a product, right? And I think that's the most fundamental problem. In some sense, the problem of Maria buying for Monica is really that Maria is willing to pay as much as Monica is willing to pay secretly, right? And I don't know that, And so most of the barriers to first-degree price discrimination come from the monopolist not knowing all the things that he or she needs to know. And so we can therefore think of the whole monopoly distortion, all the loss from monopoly, as really coming from the fact that the monopolist doesn't know how much different people are willing to pay. If he did, there would be no monopoly distortion. So to see why these problems arise, it's useful to consider some particular cases. So Cody's not here, but does somebody else want to explain why arbitrage is a problem to doing price discrimination in prescription drugs or textbooks? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, for example of textbooks, most publishers offer international editions of the books too, which aren't allowed to be sold legally in the US, but some people can buy them from international sellers anyway.
How many people have bought one of those international textbooks on Amazon? Yeah. Okay, I promise I won't report you to the government. What's your name again?
Sorry, Edgar.
Edgar.
Yeah, they're cheaper. Yeah, they're usually at a cheaper price than the US editions.
That's right. So, and drug companies have a similar problem. So, like, one reason why there's so little availability of, like, AIDS drugs in Africa is because the AIDS drug producers make a lot of money in the United States selling them for high prices to wealthy people who have AIDS in the US. And if they tried to sell them cheap in Africa, then they might get re-imported to the United States, right? And that would be a big problem for them. And this is one reason why some people support not allowing re-importation to the United States, because that's precisely what it would allow cheap AIDS drugs to be made available to people in Africa. That is just across countries, right? But imagine you tried to do perfect price discrimination, where every person within a country was given a different price for buying the textbook or a different price for buying the drug. It would be a total mess, right? I mean, it's already totally messed up when you try to do it in different countries, different prices, right? Another example that's a bit like this is related to credit cards. Justin? Yeah. What would happen if a store tried to charge different prices if you tried to use different types of credit cards at the store?
Well, you probably just start using the credit card that they charge the cheapest price for.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. But I mean, intuitively, imagine you came into a store and they were charging different prices for your favorite credit card. What would you feel about that?
They might lose customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people think it's unfair if stores charge more if you use a credit card or less if you don't use a credit or something like that, right? And so a lot of merchants accept credit cards not because they want to do it, but because they're afraid, or don't surcharge for credit cards because they don't want to alienate the consumers, even though most stores pay a big surcharge if you use the credit card. So they'd much rather that you don't use the credit card, but they don't want to charge you for that because they don't want to alienate the consumers. And in fact, there are some legal restrictions that actually make that illegal because it's so unpopular. Another issue is haggling. Why can't haggling in a market SMR be used to like achieve perfect price discrimination?
Well, sorry. Like if everyone had, you wouldn't have like there would be no constant price because everybody would want a different price. So then one person like purchasing in front of you would be like, hey, why did you give that price to that person? Like I want that too, but in a different way, like you can afford to pay more than them.
Yeah, so I mean that's a little bit like
So you-
arbitrage, but imagine what is it that makes a good haggler? Like why can't bad hagglers do well? What is the why is it so hard to be a good haggler? Does anyone have an idea? Yeah, go ahead.
Like being like if you know the worth, like the price of the product,
Yeah.
you know you don't want to offer less than what it is,
Yeah.
what it costs. But if you don't offer less, they're not gonna reduce the price at all. Like if you don't offer the person like half of the price of what they're actually asking for, they're not gonna reduce the price because they know you know the price of the product and you're willing to pay more.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to elaborate on that or?
There's like a range, right?
Yeah.
There's like a range of between the cost to the producer and the value to the consumer.
Yep.
And a good haggler can like get to the top of that range. But since you don't actually know what that is off the bat.
Yeah, so I think the nature of a good haggler is similar as like a good poker player, right? There's someone who can read what other people are thinking and sort of like knows where they're willing to go, right? And the problem is almost no one's a perfect haggler. Almost no one can perfectly read another person's mind, right? So that's the problem with getting efficiency through haggling is that people just don't really know what the other person's willing to pay. So I don't know if anyone's ever had this experience with like taxis in a developing country where you go and the taxi driver says, oh, 10 soles to go there, right? This is in Lima. And then you say, oh, that's crap, it only costs me 4 soles usually. And then they'll say, oh, whatever. And then about half the time, the taxi driver will just get pissed off at you and just drive off, right? And then you have to wait for the next taxi driver to come along, and you'll bargain with him, and you'll sort of get a sense of, well, what are they probably willing to do? And so the problem is that you just don't know. As long as there's some uncertainty about how much that guy's willing to accept and how much you're willing to pay, often the bargaining breaks down, so it doesn't work out perfectly efficiently, right? Even face-to-face. Okay, so in practice, price discrimination, because it's so hard to do perfect price discrimination, is much less perfect. And one way that companies do this is through what's called nonlinear pricing or nonlinear tariffs. That is, they charge different prices if you buy different numbers of units. So one common way to do this is to just have like a large package be cheaper per unit than a small package is. And Kenneth, what are some examples of this type of pricing that you can think of just in practice?
For example, airlines, maybe they don't charge you the same.
But is that based on quantity?
Or maybe like a restaurant. Like
Well, actually, so what were we thinking in terms of airlines? That's not a bad example, actually.
maybe they're gonna charge you depending on how much you consume, and if you consume like a lot of the services. So, I mean, if you buy a lot of tickets of that airline, maybe it's gonna cost you cheaper.
Well, you get points, right? Yeah, so that's a good example. Tejas,
That's going to bring up frequent flyer miles.
yeah, frequent flyer miles. That's exactly, I think that's sort of what Kenneth was getting at. Yeah, so that's definitely a good example. Another thing is like Costco, right? So they you can go to Costco and you can get like a ton of stuff for really cheap there, whereas like if you buy it at CVS, it's really expensive, right? Another example is like punch cards for consumers being loyal to a store, right? Like, I don't know if anyone goes to Third World Cafe, but I think they have like punch cards, right? And if you get enough coffees there, then you get one for free. New York Times does the opposite. You can get the first 20 articles for free, but then you have to pay for after that, right? Or I don't know if anyone uses SugarSync or like Dropbox, but like they give you the first certain number of gigabytes for free, and then you have to pay after that in like an increasing rate, basically. Income taxes are another example of this, right? If you earn a low amount of income, you pay a low tax rate, but then as you get to higher income, you pay a higher marginal tax rate. Yeah, go ahead.
all these tariffs. When I think of tariffs, I think of like international trade.
No, that's not, that's just, tariff means more generally price.
Okay.
International trade, that is the most common use of it, but tariff in economics just means some schedule of prices. Okay, so the goal of this is to get consumers to self-select, to buy the right amount, which reveals how much they're willing to pay. And in some cases, that means charging a lower price to people who buy more, like in the Costco case, because basically the people who are willing to like buy a bunch of stuff and make these really big trips and who don't value the convenience are willing to pay less, so you want to charge them a lower price. Or like the people who are willing to keep track of all these stupid punch cards and have their wallet be like full of all these punch cards, like don't value their time and like organization as much as they value getting a free coffee, right? And so you want to charge them lower. But the people who like value their time more are going to be willing to pay more, so you want to charge them more, right? But on the other hand, in the case of, say, the New York Times, people who only want to read a few articles probably aren't willing to pay that much for the New York Times. The people who want to read a lot are willing to pay more, and therefore you want to charge them a higher price. So what you do is all based on which type of people who buy how much are willing to pay how much, right? So this is not as effective as if you could literally charge everyone their willingness to pay for everything, because you need to incentivize people not to choose the wrong thing and therefore undermine the scheme. So you don't want to charge too little at Costco, because then everyone will go to Costco and it will ruin the whole system, right? Yeah, Maria.
So do you mean higher price to those who don't have it?
Well, like the New York Times case, right? If you don't value the New York Times very much and you just want to read one article, they'll give it to you for free. But if you value it a lot, then they're going to try to charge you a higher price.
And that's because they do it backwards, right? Because they give it to you for a lower price.
Initially,
and then,
yeah.
But then most other
Do the opposite. So the point is you could do it either way depending on who is willing to pay more. That's the idea. So here's the graphical version of that. So imagine that one person has a demand where they only want a few units, but they value those a ton, right? That's the case of where you want to give a quantity discount. If the other person wants a lot but isn't willing to pay very much for it, right? That's the case when you want to give a quantity discount and do Costco's strategy. On the other hand, imagine that there's one person who wants to buy a lot and values it a lot more. And there's another person who's not willing to buy very much and doesn't value those very much. That's like the New York Times case. So in this case, you're going to want to charge a low price to these guys and a high price to these guys. And so depending on what the different demand curves look like, that will determine whether you want to have a quantity discount or a surcharge for quantity. Okay. So this can happen not just by offering different quantities, but by offering different quality goods. And this is a strategy that we see very often. Elaine, can you, do you have some examples of times when like companies offer, similar products but of different qualities in order to try to charge like the people who are willing to pay more and more?
Well, airlines that have first class, coach, business class, and I think that's a good example.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. So classes of services in airlines or other transportation, the quality of the rooms at a hotel, they usually have like the presidential suite, the junior suite, etc. American Express cards, there's all different levels of being an American Express card holder, and they almost line up with another example, which is like all the Johnny Walker labels, right? Johnny Walker has like all these different labels and they're different quality levels, right? Tiers of cable and internet service is another example. You can buy like more faster internet, less fast internet, different numbers of channel. And a lot of people have observed that in fact the quality that's sold to people who, yeah, go ahead.
Could you consider those as